Caravan and combination weights. From time to time, seemingly one of the hot topics amongst caravanning folks here on YouTube and perhaps on Facebook as well. I don't do Facebook. Never sure how anyone actually makes a decision to get into this game. You know, drop 100, 200 grand, 400 grand without taking weights into some consideration. Actually dropping that huge amount of dollars and then finding out that, crikey, we're overweight. It's probably in my top 3 when we were thinking about it. And I'm not too sure if people just amplify things to ensure they get clicks and views. I'm not too worried about that. I'm not chasing the dough and clicks and views. I'm just trying to learn to talk better. In this particular video, I'm going to bust a few myths off Facebook. My wife reads me things off Facebook, and while I'm driving, and almost 100% of the time I have to ask her to stop because a lot of the time it's bullshit. There's also another myth I take on off YouTube. It's a simple one to bury, but people get these things in their heads. I'll get into the full weight analysis in another video, but to dispel and put these myths away, there's a fair bit of explanation. Who could have thought you'd talk this much about weights and weigh bridges, scales? Part of my field of expertise is a terrible word, but I worked amongst scales for 30 years. I'm certainly giving up a lot more knowledge than I once would have been comfortable with. You never know, you may learn something. A couple of disclaimers: I haven't figured out the focus thing on this camera yet. As I said, I've bought the camera for stills. Videos has been something I've just started to muck about with, and I haven't spent a lot of time on said manual focus on closer up stuff in the video function. So there's a nice little click clack of autofocus noise. I get around it. And the light in this room, it's quite heavy curtains in here, but sun goes behind a cloud and it changes and it turns into a sickly yellow. Anyway, it's annoying, but I'll just have to live with it. Okay, welcome back to the worst channel on YouTube. If you're unlucky enough to have stumbled in here, commiserations. However, I do know stuff. There's always stuff to learn. So we're obviously well back now, and all the travel documentation is up, as badly as it is done. Now I can do a little bit of a recap, but first I need to dispel a couple of myths. The first recap I want to do is the weights. And originally I was going to put that weights video together while we were away, but too much other stuff to do, no time to muck about with videos and processing, that type of thing. So there was a dude posting on Facebook, and I'm getting this story read to me. He was saying that weigh bridges are inaccurate, waste of time. If you read the fine print, they can have a 10% discrepancy. Okay, 100% incorrect. Personally, managed a weigh bridge for 20 years. It was a public weigh bridge for a time, and then just a trade weighted weigh bridge. The only way a weigh bridge is going to be having that sort of discrepancy is if it's uncalibrated, which means you shouldn't be using it anyway. You certainly shouldn't be charged for using a weigh bridge that has a 10% discrepancy, especially someone that's admitting having a 10% discrepancy in that fine print. In a software upgrade, I actually designed a new report, which is essentially just a weigh bridge ticket, and had it approved by the National Measurement Institute. No fine print, none at all. So that report or ticket was for a weigh bridge, for a public weigh bridge. Public weigh bridge, essentially you can charge for using the bridge, and there's a different ticket format and structure than just trade weighted. I just used to like to think of it like this. Me as the weigh bridge owner, operator, was weighing produce for a particular entity for sale to another entity. So there was a third party invoked. Whereas when I dropped the public weigh bridge, we just had a trade weighted bridge. So that public ticket and all your public numbers and signs had to go. We, as an end user, would bring the gear that we were using in, weigh it, unload it, reweigh the truck, different ticket format, still no fancy fine print though, and send him on his way. And trade weighted weigh bridge, we could pay by that weight. Not a lot of difference, well, no difference at all in the calibration procedure. Not sure if the National Measurement Institute pays more attention to checks and balances on public bridges and trade weighted bridges. However, old mate was wrong, 100% wrong. And maybe I should have had more of the post read to me, but once we got to the 10% in the fine print, please stop. So there's a few things on weigh bridges. Public weigh bridges and trade weighted weigh bridges have to be calibrated by an external operator. I think only once a year, but I was getting it done twice a year. And then of course, if there's any discrepancies, you need to get those ironed out pretty quickly. Calibration wasn't cheap. I actually entered an annual agreement, and at the time I think it was $8,000 for 2 calibrations a year for a number of scales. So we were calibrating one weighbridge and 7 or 8 other sets of scales, from floating way hoppers to platform scales. How they're calibrated, you engage a scale company, and you need to engage a good scale company. There's a few tricks. If you don't want to have them calibrated properly, those tricks can land you in plenty of hot water, and I wanted to stay out of the hot water, and part of my job was also keeping the owner out of that hot water, because it's one of those chain of responsibility things. There's some cheap operators out there that'll come and calibrate your scales. They generally don't own the standard weights and the semi-trailer to cart them around, and they come up with another hodgepodge of ways to calibrate your weighbridge. If you're going to go trade weight or par week, you definitely have to have the standard weights turn up on the back of a semi-trailer. Don't care what the cheaper operators say. So they would turn up with their truck with their standard weights on it. They would service the weighbridge, grease the cups under the load cells. They would then check the corners with standard weights. They would then run a certain amount on, take them off, run more on, take them off, run more on, take them off, right up to, I generally had 20 tonne for our weighbridge, which was 120 tonne maximum in 2x60 tonne platforms. They bring out the small weights and right down to grams to see where, with, I don't know, maybe 6 tonne, maybe 10 tonne on, the tipping point is, so where it actually changes, at what level it actually changes. So that's a key part of the final bit of the calibration. And at the very end, we'd put a truck on grossing around the 40 tonnes, and they would take the weights up then to put the 20 tonnes on behind the truck or in front of the truck to ensure that the weighbridge would blank out and we were unable to weigh anything overs. Quite a process. And each of those weighbridges, each of those 60 tonne weighbridges, back through its own Rinstrom indicator, which was where all the programming information was, because we don't really weigh anything today. We don't put a truck on and then counterbalance that with a series of weight. Today it's calculated using milliamp resistance, so the resistance is generated within the load cells as the weight rolls over it, and the calculation's then done in that Rinstrom indicator. I think it's Ohm's law. Looks fairly complex. I haven't had too much of a look at it, but I think it's Ohm's law, OHM''S law, and then that's calculated to a weight and calibrated with standard weights. So what I'm talking about is a set of scales like this, where you would place your object to be weighed in the bowl on the scale, and it would pivot down, and you would put a number of these standard weights, or standard-ish sort of weights, on the other end until it was even. Then you'd add up how much weight you'd put in, and you'd know that you had 2 pounds or 8 pounds of flour, whatever the case may be. I really need to clean these scales up. Not sure if they're worth anything. There's something I've come to own with my father's passing and my mother not able to live where she used to live. I got a lot of this sort of stuff in my shed. These scales are, of course, my grandmother's, handed down to my parents, stored in their shed for, she's been dead since 88. Where are we now? That's 36 years later. I don't know what I'm going to do with them. Now, these standard weights also have to be sent away after a time period. I can't remember where they told me they send them to, maybe in Brisbane, but they have to be recalibrated, even though they're a big lump of steel. Bits of paint get chipped off them and things like that, so they have to be brought back to whatever their allowable error margin is. Quite a complex process. Back to the 10%, we're in jail at 10%, in jail for a long time. If not in jail, significant fines. The actual number is 1%. And if you're comparing between two scales, and we did that on a regular basis, we purchased stuff out of Brisbane, for example, and out of Manildra. They had their own weighbridge, we would reweigh that. Then it just comes down to a contractual issue on whether it's an ex-store payment or a delivered payment. If you're comparing two scales, plus or minus 2%, because their scale can be 1% out, our scale can be 1% out. You would also get slayed by truck drivers, because most of them aren't that stupid, and they would know that if they filled a truck to a certain level with wheat, that it would be, for example, between 54 and 56 tonnes. And if you're going to come back at 50, they're going to know. In my game at least, the truck drivers would be all over you, or in the game that I've been in. Trucks in this day and age, or professional operators, also have calibrated scales on their gear. To run in the heavy mass program, you have to have scales The most professional guy that I know on a road train, he's getting 61 tonne. The non-professional guys are still back at 52, 53. He's charging the same freight rates. He's doing very well. Also, as part of our scale checkways, so the weighbridge was basically just using other weighbridges and what we'd weighed out of the feed mill to ascertain that it was weighing correctly. But some of our smaller platform scales, we would have a standard weight in the cupboard. We would have that standard weight put on the scale at the start of each shift, that weight recorded, and if there was an error that needed correcting, we would have to get the people in to recalibrate. The whole story from old mate on Facebook is just wrought with inaccuracy, poor information. So to run a public weighbridge, you've got to have a bit of a knowledge of the legislation, which is some of the less exciting reading you'll do in your life. But that's how that works. It's important to understand that. The other thing you don't want to get confused with is the degree of accuracy versus error margin. Now, I see another bloke saying that don't take your van and your car to a weighbridge because they're for heavy vehicles and they can be 40 or 50 kilos out. This is how scales work. I've been involved in countless scale commissionings, scale calibration. A scale can only go up in a certain number of increments. That number is 3,000, and they call them graduations. A 60-tonne weighbridge will be 3,000 graduations of 20 kilos, 60,000 kilos, 60 tonne. A 300 kilogram scale will be 3,000 graduations at 0.1 of a kilo, or 100 grams. That's how they work. That's how the calibrations work. Your degree of accuracy is going to be greater the smaller the scale you have. Error margin is still 1%. Degree of accuracy and error margin, you should never get the two confused. Us running a 120 tonne weighbridge, 120,000 kilos, 2 by 60 tonne platforms. So we're essentially calibrating two 60 tonne bridges separately. So the last calibration I was involved in, we had the error margin down under 1% on one of those bridges at plus or minus 10 kilos and on the other bridge at plus or minus 8 kilos. Much less than the 1% allowed. And these folks sign off on that, and that weighbridge then has to hold that calibration for 30 or 90 days should the government come, or the National Measurement Institute. And the National Measurement Institute can come at any time. It'll actually be a little more complex than the plus or minus 8 and plus or minus 10 due to where the tipping point sits and how that operates. That's a little bit complex, and the plus or minus 8 and plus or minus 10 will be fine for the point I'm trying to make here, or the point I am making here. Trade weighted and public weighbridges, they have to be within those specs. There's no ifs, buts or maybes. The advantages that a weighbridge is going to have is it's in the same place all the time. It's not being moved around, not losing accuracy by not being level, poor setup, what have we. And pad scales that you move about, and that's a great idea, and people provide a great service. I'm just pointing out some of the misconceptions that are out there. Scales don't really like travelling around. Scales need to be level, the whole setup needs to be level. So there's probably more chance of the travel around pad scales being inaccurate than, or being outside of error margin of 1% than a weighbridge. Other things that affect weighing and weighbridges and scales. Wind. There's been times the guys have come up to calibrate scales and been too windy, so we wouldn't. Now those weights on each weighbridge, they go through their own separate indicator, own separate set of calculations for each bridge, and then through a totalizer. If I was weighing my caravan and car on the bridge that I used to work at, and even the guy's place where I did weigh it, also two 60-tonne bridges, I'm going to utilise that setup to maximise the accuracy. You know, I'm probably going to weigh my car on the front deck and weigh my van on the back deck. I can go into the control room, get a readout for deck 1, deck 2, and through a totalizer. 10% is not correct, and you should never ever confuse degree of accuracy with error margin. Because if you're 8 tonne, 1% of 8,000 kilos, 80 kilos, doesn't matter how you weigh it on a weighbridge or a set of pad scales on the ground, 1% of 8,000 kilos is 80 kilos. Plus or minus. That's how it is. That's how percentages and life works. It's important to remember that. The other thing this guy also said was that he believed that weighbridges were for heavy vehicles. In that weighbridge that I managed and the site that I managed, we were weighing trucks anything from 14, 15 tonnes for the old local farmer derby, maybe even less. There was a farmer up the road had a couple of trucks only held 8 tonne, and he had an auger that could move grain at 180 tonne an hour. he was rapid fire. He was like machine gun. So I had to be able to weigh his trucks at say 12 or 14 tonne, right up to road train at that 120 tonne max. We didn't weigh too many out at 120 tonne, but certainly plenty 100, 110, those sorts of numbers. So the error margin is also on what's being weighed. Not, oh, it's 150 tonne weighbridge, it can be 150 kilos out. Don't work like that. And there's various plot points that they use inside that indicator to make sure that those things are linear. So even with the weighbridge, with the legislation, the way and the way it's set up, the way it has to be set up, not complex to get individual axle weights. And I've done that. I would rather use a weighbridge that is trade weighted as against scales that may not be trade weighted, may not be calibrated regularly. I just know where I sit on an accuracy front. The other couple of interesting things have come up in the last couple of days as I've been lazing around the house with quite a ruined back for the moment. My wife started reading to me that someone in Miles wanted to know the best way to get to Esk because they'd heard that the Toowoomba range was 4 kilometres long and straight down. Straight down's pretty solid, and I don't even know if it's 4 kilometres long. I can't find a number on it. But the steepest grade's 1 in 10. And there was all sorts of advice given out, but the funny thing is, you got to go down the hill somewhere. And I'm not sure why you wouldn't just choose the bypass, which is accessible from the Gore Highway and the Warrego Highway, 20 to 40 kilometres depending on where you access it. I mention these two things because I want to talk about vehicles set up for purpose for towing, because Tasmania this trip particularly brought something to light. And the other one was a guy towing a 19-foot caravan, and he'd like to go to Tasmania, but he's heard, and this is the danger of this social media rot, he's heard that the roads are terrible and they're very windy and very narrow. So I thought a little bit about that, and she'll be banned from reading me anything Facebook now for a month. I'm done with that for a bit. So I'm thinking about that. If you drive down the Gore Highway, which is a major highway from Melbourne to Brisbane, it's rubbish. Way worse than anything we encountered bitumen-wise in Tasmania. If you then go from Gundy to St George, even worse and narrow. Big shoulder drop-offs. If you go probably north of Morven up towards Orwithella and those places, also ordinary, narrow, with really, really big road trains. Really big road trains. So you're running full triple road trains up there. None of them in Tasmania. Roads narrow, yep, for sure, but still 2 lanes of narrow. You just need to watch out for the odd log truck. Poor condition, I don't know. I didn't find them that bad, to be honest. Certainly worse in and across Victoria. New South Wales, the road from Temora to Cootamundra was woeful, and some of the road from Cootamundra to Young and Cowra was also woeful. The road north of Coolah, very wicked until you got back across onto that New England highway. I'm not sure where people are going. I could take you to some roads in Tasmania that I wouldn't tow on that we drove. They were pretty rugged, but not as rugged as the super duper 4-wheel driver wants to get into, but just big potholes and sort of off-roadish for me, but not where you'd tow. Yeah, the roads in Tasmania, definitely windy. I used to be a bit nervous about towing down the Toowoomba range. In fact, I still haven't done it. I have no ambition to caravan to the coast or anywhere there's lots of people. But after doing quite a bit, maybe 20,000 Ks in the last 4 years in Tasmania, Toowoomba range is flat and straight. Not even an issue. More things to worry about in Toowoomba's the roads, the drivers, a couple of intersections. If I was going to go down towards Brisbane, I would probably head out, get on the bypass and go down that way and just avoid town altogether. I don't know if people are missing out on a lot of stuff because they read and believe the mumbo jumbo that comes with Facebook and even YouTube. And herein lies the problem. People that don't know, hear something, get it on Facebook, share it with, at times, vast audiences who continue to share it. All of a sudden, you've got a large number of people believing incredibly incorrect information. It's a problem. You need to actually have a bit of a look around. The 10% is what would tip me, because it's a big number. And look, there's a raft of people out there that don't understand percentages either, so I'm not sure how you counter that. The stuff on weights in particular on YouTube, I am yet to find much that's 100% right. Some of it's partially right. A bit of it is 100% right. And I guess what you got to remember is that an opinion isn't a fact. that will lead into how I see performance of the car that we took down there and the setup, the combination that we took down there, and why, if I was going to be doing more, I would certainly have a different tow vehicle. Also in this analysis phase, after we look at weights, we'll look at how the car performed and how I saw the car as performing. Once again, that will be my opinion based on some facts, but it's still only going to be my opinion. We'll also look at some fun stuff like the bakery list and some other real stuff, what campgrounds we liked, and once again won't be a recommendation, what campgrounds we liked that we didn't stay at for various reasons. Top places to eat, we ate out a fair bit, as we do, but one particular town sticks in mind. And I don't do recommendations, it's not my style. I don't do reviews, I just look at my opinions based on my observations or our observations. So next up, we'll actually get into the full weight analysis, individual axle weights, tire weights, all of those sorts of things. Not sure how I'm going to do that yet. Whiteboard would be good, but it means I've got to go to town and buy one, so that's not going to happen. I'll have to figure out how I'm going to do that.